chapter 10, and this is part 3. 9th of August. The captain ordered a rehearsal of the parade of the ship's company as HMS Prince of Wales neared her destination. Walter and George stood near the bow, watching the men emerge from all parts of the ship in their everyday uniforms, looking more like a shipwrecked crew. George grinned. "Don't worry, Inspector, when the parade itself takes place, they'll all be immaculate." The mist lifted with the arrival of dawn in Newfoundland's Placentia Bay. Churchill hopped from foot to foot as they saw the jagged grey outline of the US destroyers come into view. The USS Augusta, the presidential flagship, was anchored with several other ships, but Churchill's ship steered away from the bay and put out to sea again. The Prime Minister was furious and walked to the bridge. "Get me an audience with Admiral Tovey." The Admiral gave Churchill a smart salute. "Sorry, sir, I've been asked by the Americans to take a trip around the bay to rendezvous at the correct time. We are an hour and a half early." Churchill stamped along the deck. George gave Walter a cheeky wink. "Shall I go and find his marching music?" Churchill took out a cigar. "We mustn't be early for our first date, must we, George?" An hour and a half later, the HMS Prince of Wales approached once more and passed between the American ships. The band struck up an invigorating version of the Stars and Stripes. The Augusta replied by playing "God Save the King." When the Prince of Wales came to anchor, senior officers from both ships visited each other to exchange formal greetings. At last, Churchill, Walter and George boarded the Augusta. George beamed and shook everyone's hand as he climbed the gangplank. Roosevelt stood by the rail, supported by his son Elliot, admiring the long, sleek, pale grey HMS Prince of Wales at anchor. The ship's band played the two national anthems. There was silence. The ship's company waited. Churchill moved forward and greeted Roosevelt with a firm, warm handshake. He looked into the movie cameras and handed Roosevelt a written greeting from the King. The words were lost as the sound camera did not work. A second attempt at recording was made, but the equipment failed again. "Mr. Roosevelt, we really need your help," whispered George. "We British can't even make a sound recorder work." Once the formal introductions were concluded, Churchill's party returned to the Prince of Wales to change for lunch. A shout went up from the sailors. Several small boats manned by American Marines wearing their dress blue uniforms and white caps had come alongside. The boats contained hundreds of cardboard boxes, and the Marines began to pile them onto the deck. Each one contained 200 cigarettes, 2 apples, an orange, and half a pound of cheese. There was a message. "The Commander-in-Chief, United States Navy, sends his compliments and best wishes. Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, August 9th, 1941. Walter returned to his cabin. He picked up the bookmark Churchill had dropped. Printed in bold was "Ask and it shall be given. Seek and you shall find." The 10th of August, Placentia Bay, Newfoundland. The sun's rays burned through the early mist on the bay, illuminating the ships anchored in the harbour. Roosevelt joined Churchill aboard the Prince of Wales for a joint service of Thanksgiving. Churchill had selected well-known hymns, and all the sailors knew. It was a simple service conducted by a British naval chaplain who stood at a rostrum draped with the British and American flags. When prayers were said, Walter shut his eyes and asked God to protect Bernie, Emily, Stella and Martin, and to love Kate in heaven. Later, over lunch, George stared at his plate. He touched Walter's foot under the table. "You can see we need your help, Mr. President. We can't even afford a decent spread for you and your sailors. Most of this food looks like it came out of an old tin. Let's hope you take pity on us and send us some supplies." As Churchill waved farewell to Roosevelt, a black and white cat, the ship's mascot, wound itself around Churchill's legs. "Hello, Puss." He picked up the cat and stroked it while Roosevelt returned his salute by waving his hat. The crews gave a cheer. Churchill panted as he strode around the deck. He stopped at Walter's cabin and looked round the door. "I've decided to go ashore. Give me something to do while the President thinks about our proposals." "Sir, can you give me 5 minutes to check the security arrangements with the American Secret Service?" Churchill and Walter stepped onto the jetty and thanked the marine officer for taking them to shore. Walter took stock of the port and Churchill walked towards the hill behind the harbour. The sun warmed their backs as they began to climb. The old man made schoolboy jokes, nudging Walter every other step. He stopped, looked Walter in the eye and started to jog, attempting to race Walter to the top. Walter let him stay ahead a few yards from the summit. He took the lead. At the top they sat breathless on the grass, admiring the sight of the ships in the calm waters below. Without warning, it began to shower, even though the sun was still shining. Churchill and Walter half ran, half slid back down the hill. By the time they reached the ship, they were soaked. They stood together and admired the huge rainbow over the harbour. "Good sign," said Churchill. "I've come for that pot of gold." Back on the Augusta, Walter strolled on deck while Churchill resumed talks with the President. Walter recognised the stance of another policeman ahead of him. He called out, "Mike Riley." The United States Special Agent turned and smiled at Walter. "Inspector Thompson, Scotland Yard. Nice to meet you, buddy. In person, but where are all your men?" Walter laughed. "It's only George and I for Winston." "Ha, I've 25 men guarding the President, and I still feel it's not enough." I could imagine his face if I asked for another 23 men. He likes his freedom and wouldn't allow it. He'd rather just take the risks. Churchill appeared along the gangway and stopped in front of the two men. Walter stepped forward. "Sir, this is my opposite number, Special Agent Mike Riley. We talk all the time on the scrambler phone. He's offered to introduce me to the President." Churchill took out a cigar and offered one to Mike. "I hear good reports of you, Agent Riley. Keep up the good work. But Thompson, I will introduce you to the President." President Roosevelt was sitting at his desk in the cabin when they entered. Churchill puffed white smoke as he said, "Inspector Thompson has guarded me faithfully for a period of nearly 20 years. It gives me great pleasure to introduce him to you." The President replied, "Inspector Thompson of Scotland Yard. Mike Riley thinks very highly of you and your attention to detail." Churchill and Mike Riley withdrew from the room. The President leaned over his desk. "How is he standing up under pressure, Thompson? How is he really coping?" Walter paused for a second, searching for a diplomatic answer. He has a marvellous reserve of energy and good working habits, including the habit of periodic rest." The President smiled. "Is he hard to handle?" Walter took a step back. "Yes, sir. He's reckless and self-willed. He can't bear any kind of restraint being placed on him." "Look after him." "Of course I will. It's my job. Your Mr. Churchill is one of the greatest men alive. You have a very important job, Inspector." Back aboard the HMS Prince of Wales, Walter picked up a document everyone was calling the Atlantic Charter. The first page read, "A joint declaration of war and peace aims of the United States of America and Britain." George put his head into Churchill's cabin. "The old man's not confident the Americans will fight with us. They'll certainly help us out in the Atlantic by attacking U-boats, but American public opinion is strongly in favour of staying out of the war. It will take something pretty spectacular to change their minds. Where is he, by the way?" Walter looked towards the head. "Bathing." 15th of August, HMS Prince of Wales. Walter stood with George on deck enjoying the salty sea air. Gazing into the distance, he noticed the spiky black silhouette of a city on the horizon. He screwed up his eyes to get a better look. Reykjavik, George? The ship slowed, and as the Prince of Wales cut through the water, the city divided itself into the individual shapes of a huge convoy of American ships. Walter's eyes were moist. George did a little dance on the spot. Thank God, just look at that lot. The President must have sent the convoy to help us even before the talks were over. Each ship was crammed with boxes, crates, aircraft, tanks and trucks lashed to their decks. As the Prince of Wales drew close to the American convoy, a narrow corridor unzipped itself through the centre to allow the British ships to sail through. The American crews lined the sides to watch them pass. The naval ratings aboard the Prince of Wales were summoned on deck to view the magnificent sight. When the British ships reached the centre of the convoy, every American vessel let off its foghorn. Walter put his fingers in his ears and a single tear trickled down his cheek. George shouted above the noise, "If Adolf could see this lot, he'd be so mad, he'd go into a blind rage. Thank you, Mr. President. The British people thank you from the bottom of our hearts." Churchill looked out of his porthole and took a long draw of his cigar. He played the Colonel Bogey March on the gramophone. He saluted his porthole, tightened the cord on his pyjamas and began quick marching in his cabin. And that's the end of chapter 10. Some hope.